The presence of Freemasonry in Africa is a tale woven into the fabric of colonial conquest, social engineering, cultural subjugation, and paradoxically, resistance. Introduced by European colonialists, Freemasonry in African colonies was never merely a spiritual or fraternal enterprise. It was a covert network of influence, privilege, and power that operated beneath the surface of imperial rule. European Masonic lodges were often reserved for white settlers and colonial elites, functioning as exclusive clubs where decisions about governance, economics, and cultural policy were whispered over ritual and whiskey. These lodges mirrored the hierarchical structure of colonial society, reinforcing racial and class divisions while creating an undercurrent of mutual allegiance among colonial administrators, businessmen, and military officers. Yet, over time, indigenous elites, African professionals, chiefs, and politicians began to be initiated into these secretive circles, transforming Freemasonry from a purely colonial institution into a double-edged sword that could also serve the ambitions and agency of the colonized. Freemasonry first entered Africa with the Portuguese in the 18th century and expanded rapidly under British, French, and Dutch colonial rule in the 19th and 20th centuries. Lodges were set up in key port cities and colonial administrative centers such as Cape Town, Lagos, Dakar, Nairobi, and Accra. These lodges were modeled after their European counterparts, importing the symbolism, rituals, and secrecy that marked Masonic practice abroad. However, within the colonial context, these lodges took on an added layer of significance. They became centers of soft power, arenas in which colonial officials could coordinate policies informally outside the scrutiny of the formal state apparatus. Freemasonry provided an institutional cloak that masked the political from the fraternal, allowing colonial elites to cultivate trust and loyalty among themselves while making it difficult for outsiders, particularly the indigenous majority, to penetrate or understand their inner workings. The racial exclusivity of these lodges in the early stages of colonialism mirrored the broader racial hierarchies imposed by imperial regimes. In French West Africa, for instance, Freemasonry was closely tied to the ideology of assimilation, the belief that African subjects could become French through education, language, and cultural conformity. Masonic lodges, often aligned with the French Grand Orient, promoted Enlightenment values such as reason, secularism, and republicanism, yet remained deeply paternalistic. African membership was limited to a small, educated elite, often the so-called évolués, who were seen as sufficiently civilized to be initiated. These African Masons were sometimes used as intermediaries between the colonial state and the indigenous population, serving both as symbols of imperial benevolence and instruments of indirect rule. Yet for many of these African Freemasons, initiation also provided access to otherwise unattainable networks of power and knowledge. Within the secrecy of the lodge, they could learn European customs, engage in intellectual debates, and build alliances that would later serve them in the nationalist movements of the 20th century. British colonial lodges, particularly in places like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, followed a slightly different model. In many British colonies, Freemasonry maintained a stronger connection to the Crown and the Anglican Church and was more conservative in its racial policies. In South Africa, Freemasonry was entangled with the politics of apartheid and white supremacy, with most lodges excluding black Africans outright until the late 20th century. In settler colonies like Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Masonic lodges were bastions of white colonial identity, spaces in which settlers could reaffirm their cultural distinctiveness, discuss land policy, and consolidate their grip over the political economy. Yet even here, cracks began to appear as some African nationalists saw in Freemasonry not only a colonial tool, but also a potential platform for cross-cultural exchange and covert resistance. Indeed, by the mid-20th century, as African nationalism surged and the winds of decolonization began to blow across the continent, the role of Freemasonry underwent a complex transformation. African leaders who had been educated in European schools and sometimes initiated into Masonic lodges began to use these networks to their own advantage. Figures such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire, and Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal were rumored to have Masonic affiliations or connections with Masonic circles. While these associations were rarely advertised, owing to the secretive nature of Freemasonry and the suspicion it aroused among both colonial authorities and traditional African communities, they nevertheless served as useful tools. Through Masonic ties, these leaders could access European political and business elites, negotiate independent settlements, and protect themselves from the arbitrary violence of the colonial state. The ambiguity of Freemasonry's role in Africa is particularly evident in the way it straddled both oppression and liberation. On the one hand, it was a tool of colonial control, a shadow government that allowed colonial elites to network, conspire, and protect their interests behind closed doors. On the other hand, for some Africans, it was a gateway to upward mobility and political influence. In the colonial setting, where access to state power was heavily restricted by race and class, Freemasonry provided a rare space in which Africans could interact as near equals with Europeans. Even as Masonic lodges promoted Western values and cosmopolitan ideals, they also became incubators for African self-determination and leadership. This duality is perhaps best illustrated by the evolution of African Masonic lodges after independence. In many newly independent African states, Freemasonry remained a prominent feature of elite political life. Presidents, judges, generals, and businessmen often held Masonic membership, using the fraternity as a private arena for negotiation, patronage, and alliance building. In countries like Nigeria and Kenya, lodges became deeply embedded in the post-colonial political system, sometimes accused of operating as states within the state. Critics have often pointed to the opacity of Freemasonry as a danger to democratic accountability, alleging that key political decisions are made not in parliament or cabinet, but in Masonic temples, away from public scrutiny. The Masonic ideal of fraternity and mutual support can easily mutate into cronyism and corruption, especially in fragile political systems. Yet, African Freemasonry has also undergone a process of localization. In post-independence Africa, Masonic lodges began to incorporate African cultural elements, rituals, and languages into their practice. This blending of European and African traditions reflects the broader hybridity of African modernity, a fusion of colonial inheritance and indigenous agency. Some African Masonic lodges have even distanced themselves from their European parent organizations, forming independent grand lodges that assert a distinct African identity. These local lodges often focus on philanthropy, education, and community development, positioning themselves as moral pillars in societies plagued by inequality and dysfunction. Whether this transformation represents a genuine democratization of Freemasonry or merely its repackaging by post-colonial elites is a matter of debate. The secrecy surrounding Freemasonry has also contributed to its mystique and to widespread suspicion, particularly among religious communities. In many African countries, both Christian and Muslim leaders have denounced Freemasonry as a satanic cult, accusing it of undermining traditional values and promoting occult practices. Evangelical preachers, in particular, have targeted Freemasons as agents of spiritual corruption, linking them to conspiracy theories about global domination, devil worship, and the New World Order. This hostility is compounded by the opaque nature of Masonic rituals and the elite status of many of its members. In societies where economic inequality and political exclusion are rampant, the idea that the powerful gather secretly to plot their interests is not just plausible, It resonates deeply with lived experience. The relationship between Freemasonry and African traditional religions is another area of tension and intrigue. In some cases, the symbolic and ritualistic aspects of Freemasonry have clashed with indigenous beliefs, creating confusion and resistance among local populations. In other instances, however, parallels have been drawn between Masonic symbolism and African cosmology. The use of symbols, the emphasis on secrecy, and the structure of initiation have echoes in many African spiritual traditions. This has led some African Masons to argue that Freemasonry is not alien to African culture, but rather an extension or adaptation of existing practices. Still, the tension between imported rituals and indigenous belief systems continues to complicate Freemasonry's standing in African societies. In conclusion, Freemasonry in Africa cannot be understood as a simple extension of European imperialism or as a benign fraternity of enlightened men. It is a multifaceted institution. Introduced as a network of colonial power, it evolved into a contested space of both complicity and resistance. It provided cover for imperial ambition while also offering tools for African empowerment. Whether Freemasonry is ultimately a force for good or ill in Africa remains an open question. What is clear, however, is that its lodges have long been sites of quiet influence, where the rituals of secrecy veil the strategies of power.